Continuing to look at globalization, we'll take a quick review here. Globalization is just the increasing worldwide connections between people. Our economies are connected together. You're buying stuff at the store that was produced in another country with materials from a different country. You are eating foods from different cultures. You're watching movies and TV and listening to music from all over the world. Politics is all intertwined, increasingly so in our modern world with modern technology that sped up communication and travel so much. And modernization theory is basically just the idea that this is a great thing for poor countries because participating in this global economy, in global capitalism, will gradually improve the economies of poor countries and improve people's lives and bring their culture and their way of life into the modern world. But there is also the question of who benefits most from modernization. The Marxist perspective looks at global capitalism much in the same way it looks at capitalism within a country. Wealthy countries are the bourgeoisie of the world. They own the means of production, and they exploit poor countries. Wealthy countries have the means to start factories in different parts of the world and to transport goods from place to place. And so they have the power. And it all started with colonialism. Long before the modern era of global capitalism, before even the Industrial Revolution, countries in certain parts of the world, particularly in Europe, but also Japan had their own empire, they were taking political control of other parts of the world. And so this shows, this is red is Britain here, and they at one time controlled what is now the United States and Canada, much of Africa, India, and Australia. The US rebelled and got their freedom, but then went and colonized other parts of the world. We still have colonies today. When a country is colonized, it's controlled, it's political control from another country elsewhere in the world. And when you look at the countries, the poor countries today, they tend to be those countries that were colonized most heavily a couple hundred years ago, even just 100 years ago. Dependency theory states that when these colonized countries became independent, they didn't come into the global marketplace, the global economy, on an equal playing field. They came in underdeveloped. The countries that had been colonizing them were exploiting them, taking advantage of what they had, and making, much of the time, very little effort to modernize their political or economic institutions. They came into the global system lacking technology, lacking the ability to compete fairly. And multinational corporations, which invest in these countries, are investing for their own profit. They control the country's economy in what we call neo-colonialism. So it's not political control anymore, it's not old school colonialism, but neo-colonialism is economic control, often by these multinational corporations, and you can generally kind of say by the wealthy countries themselves. Wealthy countries control the means of production. They control the factories. They control the trade. They make the terms of trade and can exploit these peripheral countries. So the economic world system is a part of dependency theory that looks at how core countries of the West and Australia and Japan has come into this realm of core countries as well, exploit these peripheral countries. Looking at the exports, at the economic output of these countries, we see that the poor countries, the countries that were colonized until very recently, they're not producing high-value goods. They're primarily producing raw resources. And so multinational corporations are able to go into parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America and very, very cheaply get the materials they need to produce expensive products, send them to another part of the world to have them actually turned into something more worthwhile, and then they're sold back all over the world at a much higher price. So the workers in the poor countries are getting paid very little to produce what will become a very expensive good that they won't be able to afford themselves. And if you look at which countries are industrialized, you see it largely goes along with the countries that were once colonized and the countries that are now producing what resources they are producing. So Africa, largely poor countries and producing raw materials, largely unindustrialized. East Asia has benefited more than much of the world from this system. They have managed to jump on the train, and they are now producing a lot of high-value goods. Dependency theory says that while governments are giving loans to these poor countries, the loans are being given under the terms made by the wealthy countries, which means they are made in the core wealthy countries' interest. They give loans to weak governments. Often those loans go to elite groups in that society, people who are already on top of their stratification systems. And yet the whole country is put in debt. So the poor people are subject to paying back the debt that they may never have seen any benefit from. And when countries can't pay back their debts, they are expected to take austerity measures, meaning cutting back on social services, meaning the poor people in those countries then suffer even more. Multinational corporations are investing for their own profit. They want poor countries to produce what they can make the most money of, which is largely export goods, largely luxury goods, because when you look at the worldwide system, the worldwide stratification of wealth, it's even more extreme inequality than within our country. So most of the wealth that's out there to be had is held by a few very wealthy people. And that means if you want to make more money, you need to sell to those wealthy people. Investment is going to those already in power. They're importing technology that, yes, helps people produce things, but also makes them dependent on those foreign powers, on foreign fuel, on foreign parts, on foreign services, because that imported technology isn't generally being produced, and what's necessary for it isn't being produced within the countries where it's being imported. Finally, multinational corporations have power in the marketplace. They can produce things cheaper with industrialization, with movement of goods from place to place, than small businesses can, making things with less technology. And so they tend to force out smaller businesses, and where they can't force them out, they'll buy them out. And so monopolies taking over more and more of the world. Overall, the economy of poor countries does seem to grow, although more in some places than others. And within those countries, within every poor country that is now starting to industrialize, inequality has increased dramatically. So this is countries of the world scaled by population, to give you a sense of the way wealth is stratified within the world. This is country scaled by wealth. So here's the United States by wealth, and the United States by population. Here's India by population, and India by wealth. Japan was one of the first Asian countries to really start to benefit from this system. And you can see their population is relatively small, but they're one of the economic powerhouses of the world. Whereas Africa, in terms of wealth, is tiny. In terms of population, is quite large, which means every person living in Africa, on average, has far, far less wealth than the average person living in wealthier parts of the world. So global poverty may be decreasing in the world, but it's in some places decreasing far more than others. And absolute poverty still affects a huge number of people. When we talk about poverty in the United States, we're talking about relative poverty. We're talking about some people having more than others. And, relative poverty means you're struggling, but it doesn't mean that you're starving. Absolute poverty means people don't have enough for basic survival. And there's some 2 billion people in the world today living on less than $2 a day, meaning they're struggling to get the basic things they need to survive. And there's over 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, meaning less than $1.25 per day for everything they need to survive. And if you pause for 60 seconds, just watch the clock for 60 seconds, 10 people will have died during that time from conditions directly related to lack of food. So East Asia has benefited greatly. Sub-Saharan Africa, its movement away from poverty is very, very slow. Finally, since we won't have time to get into environmental issues, just wanted to touch very briefly on the idea of environmental justice. That one of the problems of global capitalism, global industrialization, is that the environmental problems caused by industrialization, caused by pollution of air and water, caused by unsafe conditions, these problems are seen far more by poor people than they are by wealthy people. Wealthy people can afford land that's not been polluted. Poor people are generally forced into those areas that are most polluted. The worst industrial processes are going to happen in the poorest countries, because wealthy countries increase their environmental regulations. Wealthy countries recognize and can afford to protect the environment, at least locally. But they're buying products from other countries, from unregulated countries. And so multinational corporations are selling at great profit to fairly clean, wealthy countries while producing those products in countries where people are suffering for their cheap production. Environmental refugees are likely to soon become a major problem in the world, with the problems like climate change, particularly caused by industrialization. More and more parts of the world are going to become unlivable, and it's going to be the poor people, the poorest people in the world, that suffer and that have to find new places to live, meaning they're moving into new countries. They become refugees. Refugee camps growing simply because people no longer have land to live on. Finally, we have to be careful not to be ethnocentric in our discussion of these global issues. There is good to modernization and there is bad to modernization. But either way, we have to ask, is our assumption of what it means to improve, what it means to have a good life, what it means to have a good cultural and economic and political system shared by the people in these countries that we're talking about? Modernization affects culture. It changes people's ways of life, and cultural changes can be damaging. McDonaldization is the process, after McDonald's, the fast food restaurant, of American-style consumer and business culture taking over more and more of the world. In fact, you see actual McDonald's in all different places in the world, and that means those type of businesses are pushing out other more traditional places to eat and work